The morning mist clung to the great river like the breath of sleeping spirits, and in that half-light between night and dawn, the massive earth mounds of the city rose from the floodplain like the work of giants. For generations beyond counting, this place had stood as the beating heart of a trading empire that stretched from the cold northern lakes to the warm southern waters, where shells came north in exchange for copper and stone. The wooden palisade that encircled the central plaza caught the first rays of sunlight, casting long shadows across the packed earth where soon thousands would gather for the day's commerce and ceremony. But this morning carried something different in its stillness, a tension that even the early rising vendors setting up their wares along the market paths seemed to sense. The runner who had arrived 3 days past had brought news that would challenge everything the city's leaders thought they knew about the great river's moods, and today, after much discussion in private lodges and hushed conversations around cooking fires, the council would meet to decide how to respond. The vendors themselves moved with less of their usual casual efficiency as they arranged displays of pottery, carved bone implements, and bundles of medicinal plants gathered from the forests that stretched away from the river valley. Many had traveled for days to reach this market, following trails that connected the great city to settlements scattered across vast territories, and they carried with them not just goods for trade, but rumors and concerns that added weight to the morning's already heavy atmosphere. Word of the northern river disruptions had spread through the informal networks that connected traders, travelers, and message runners across distances that could take moons to traverse. Each telling had added new details, some accurate and others distorted by the fears and hopes of those who passed them along, until the basic facts had become wrapped in speculation about everything from angry spirits to invasions by hostile peoples from unknown territories. What remained consistent across all versions was the scale and speed of the changes being reported. Rivers that had flowed in the same channels for generations beyond memory were carving new paths through the landscape seemingly overnight, stranding communities that had built their entire way of life around predictable water access and forcing mass relocations that disrupted trade relationships stretching back to the time of the first settlements. The plaza sweeper, bent with age but still strong enough to clear the ceremonial grounds each dawn, paused in his work to watch the sun climb higher above the timber circle that marked the sacred directions. He had witnessed 43 seasons of council meetings in this place, had seen leaders rise and fall like the river's own rhythms, and he understood better than most that some decisions carved themselves into the very bones of the earth. Today felt like one of those days when the future would pivot on the wisdom or foolishness of those who claimed to speak for the thousands who called this place home. Down at the river docks, canoes were already arriving from the outlying settlements, their hulls heavy with late-season corn, dried fish, and bundles of the prized flint that the city's craftsmen shaped into points sharper than any talon or tooth. The traders who piloted these vessels moved with the easy confidence of men and women who had navigated these waters since childhood, reading the subtle signs that told of shifting sandbars, changing currents, and the river's endless appetite for reshaping the channels that fed the city's prosperity. Among them was the trader, known simply as River Walker, whose network of contacts extended further upstream than any other merchants, and whose arrival this morning had been anticipated by several members of the council. She carried with her not just goods for exchange, but information that would prove crucial to the day's deliberations. As she guided her vessel toward the wooden loading platforms that jutted into the brown water, she noticed how the river level had dropped again overnight, exposing fresh mud banks that hadn't been visible even a moon ago. The other traders who worked the docks that morning shared her concerns, though few spoke of them openly. The seasonal patterns that had governed their movements for decades seemed to be shifting in ways that challenged everything they thought they understood about the river's behavior. Water levels that should have remained stable were fluctuating unpredictably, and some of the channels that provided access to outlying settlements were becoming too shallow for heavily loaded canoes. The wooden platforms themselves told part of the story, with repair marks showing where they had been hastily adjusted to accommodate changing water levels. The dock builders, whose expertise in reading the river's moods was legendary throughout the trading network, worked with a new kind of urgency as they reinforced existing structures and prepared for further modifications that might be needed as conditions continued to evolve. Even the fish that formed a crucial part of the city's food supply seemed to be responding to changes in the water. The traditional fishing spots that had provided reliable catches for generations were producing smaller harvests, while species normally found only during certain seasons were appearing at unexpected times. The fisher families who provided this essential resource spoke in worried tones of signs and omens that suggested the river itself was in some kind of distress. The children, who normally swarmed the docks to help unload cargo in exchange for small gifts, seemed subdued today, as if sensing their elders' unease. They went about their work quietly, stacking bundles and baskets with careful precision, while casting occasional glances toward the great mound that dominated the city's center, where the chief's lodge stood like a watchtower over all the activity below. Smoke was already rising from that lodge, indicating that the early morning discussions among the inner circle had begun before most of the city had awakened. As the sun climbed higher and the morning mist burned away, revealing the full scope of the settlement that spread along both banks of the river, the true magnitude of what hung in the balance became clear. This was no ordinary trading post or seasonal gathering place, but a permanent city whose population rivaled anything found in the warm lands far to the south, where the great stone pyramids rose toward the sky. Here, in the heart of the continent, thousands of people had built lives dependent on the river's moods and the complex web of trade relationships that the city's location made possible. The wooden palisade that surrounded the central plaza stood 3 times taller than a man, its sharpened posts driven deep into the earth and bound together with cordage made from the inner bark of basswood trees. Walking in its shadow was like moving through a canyon of human creation, and today that shadow seemed deeper than usual, as if the very structure sensed the gravity of the decisions to be made within its protective embrace. Children who had finished their morning duties along the docks now played games among the smaller mounds that dotted the city's residential areas, their laughter echoing off the earthen walls of the lodges where their parents worked at the countless tasks that kept such a large settlement functioning. The boys practiced with small bows, sending blunt arrows toward targets made from woven grass, while the girls played complex games involving colored stones and intricate rules that mirrored the diplomatic negotiations their mothers conducted in the trading houses. But even in their play, the children reflected the subtle tensions that permeated the adult world. The games were more structured today, less spontaneous, as if the weight of their elders' concerns had settled onto young shoulders like an invisible burden. The older children, those approaching the age when they would begin learning the specialized crafts that would define their adult roles, seemed particularly aware that something significant was stirring in the councils of their leaders. In the workshop areas that clustered around the base of the smaller mounds, craftsmen and craftswomen pursued their trades with the focused intensity that had made the city's products sought after across vast distances. The coppersmiths who worked the metal that came down from the northern lakes shaped ornamental pieces whose beauty was matched only by their symbolic power, while the potters created vessels that would carry the city's influence far beyond the reach of its traders' canoes. The flint knappers, whose skill determined the quality of the points and blades that armed the city's hunters and warriors, worked in careful silence today, their concentration deeper than usual. The quality of their work was crucial not just for the city's own needs, but for its reputation among the distant tribes who valued sharp, well-made tools above almost any other trade good. A single, poorly crafted point could damage relationships that had taken generations to build, and everyone understood that in times of uncertainty, the city's alliances would prove more valuable than any amount of stored corn or cached copper. When the timber circle's shadow pointed directly earthward, marking the sun's highest climb, a different kind of stillness settled over the central plaza. The normal midday bustle of commerce and social interaction gave way to something more expectant, as word spread through the residential areas that the council would convene earlier than usual. The news the runner had brought from the northern reaches of the river network was finally ready to be shared with the broader leadership, and the implications were staggering enough to demand immediate attention. The runner herself, a woman whose lean frame and weathered face spoke of countless journeys along the trading paths that connected the city to its far-flung partners, sat in the cool interior of the guest lodge where honored visitors rested between their travels. She had spoken privately with the chief and his closest advisors, sharing details that had kept them in heated discussion for 3 straight days. Now, as the formal council prepared to convene, she reviewed once more the message she carried from the settlements that lay a full moon's journey upstream. The northern rivers were changing their courses more dramatically than anyone had seen in living memory. Not the gradual shifts that marked the normal passage of seasons, but sudden, violent redirections that had already stranded 2 major trading posts and threatened to cut off the water routes that carried the city's influence deep into the northern territories. Worse yet, the changes seemed to be accelerating, driven by forces that the most experienced river readers couldn't predict or explain. For a trading empire built around water transportation, such news represented a threat more serious than war or famine. The canoe routes that connected the city to its satellite settlements and distant trading partners were the arteries through which flowed not just goods, but information, people, and the cultural influences that made the city more than just a large settlement. If those routes were being disrupted on a scale unprecedented in the collective memory of the northern peoples, then everything the city's prosperity depended upon was suddenly in question. The implications extended far beyond simple logistics. The city's position as the central hub of a vast trading network was based on its location at the confluence of several major waterways, a geographic advantage that had made it the natural meeting point for traders from all directions. But if the northern rivers were being reshaped by whatever forces the runner described, then competing settlements might suddenly find themselves better positioned to capture the trade that had long flowed toward the great mounds and wooden walls that defined this place. As the sun began its afternoon descent toward the western horizon, the council members gathered in the great lodge that crowned the tallest mound, their faces grave with the knowledge that the decisions made in the next few hours would determine their people's fate for generations to come. The lodge itself was a marvel of engineering and craftsmanship, its massive wooden frame supporting a roof capable of sheltering 200 people, while intricate carvings on the support posts told the story of the city's founding and growth. The chief, a man whose authority derived not from birth alone, but from decades of wise leadership through previous crises, took his place at the center of the circle while the other council members arranged themselves according to the complex protocols that governed such gatherings. To his right sat the trade masters, whose detailed knowledge of the river networks and distant markets made them indispensable to any discussion of the city's future. To his left, the construction chiefs who oversaw the massive earthwork projects that continued to reshape the settlement's skyline. Behind them, in carefully ordered ranks, sat the representatives of the various residential districts, the craft specialists whose expertise gave weight to their voices in council, and the war leaders whose responsibility for the city's defense made their opinions crucial in any discussion that might affect relationships with neighboring peoples. At the very back of the gathering, silent but observant, sat the keepers of the sacred traditions whose role was to ensure that any decisions made aligned with the spiritual obligations that bound the people to this place and to each other. The runner was called forward to repeat her message for the full council, and her words fell into the hushed space like stones dropped into still water. She spoke of rivers changing course overnight, of trading posts suddenly finding themselves stranded on dry channels while new waterways carved themselves through previously solid ground. She described conversations with northern leaders who spoke of earth tremors that preceded the water's redirection, and of strange atmospheric phenomena that seemed to herald each new disruption. Most disturbing of all, she reported that the changes showed no sign of slowing or stabilizing. The northern settlements that had sent her south with this message were already beginning to discuss abandoning their traditional territories in favor of locations that might prove more stable in the face of whatever forces were reshaping the waterways. If such movements began on a large scale, the entire network of relationships that sustained the city's prosperity could collapse within a single season. The discussion that followed the runner's report stretched through the afternoon like a slow-burning fire, each council member's contribution adding new dimensions to a problem that seemed to grow more complex with every word spoken. The trademasters spoke of alternate routes that might maintain contact with northern partners, but acknowledged that such alternatives would be longer, more dangerous, and potentially controlled by rival settlements that had no reason to accommodate the city's needs. The chief of the copper workers raised concerns about maintaining the supply lines that brought the raw metal from the distant northern lakes, without which the city's reputation for fine metalwork would quickly diminish. The routes that carried this precious material had remained stable for so many generations that they were taken for granted. But if the northern disruption spread, even these ancient pathways might be threatened. The leader of the shell traders spoke of similar vulnerabilities in the southern networks that brought marine ornaments and ceremonial materials from the warm coastal waters. While the southern routes had shown no signs of disruption yet, the interconnected nature of the trading system meant that problems in one region inevitably affected all others. If northern traders could no longer reliably reach the central city, the entire balance of exchange relationships might collapse. The construction chiefs raised the possibility of massive engineering projects that might redirect local waterways to compensate for whatever disruptions occurred upstream, but such undertakings would require resources on a scale that could cripple the city's other activities for years to come. The engineering knowledge existed, gathered from generations of building the massive earthworks that gave the city its distinctive profile, but applying that knowledge on the scale required would test the limits of what was possible. The war leaders, thinking as always in terms of security and defense, wondered whether the northern disruptions might represent an opportunity for expansion into territories that their traditional inhabitants could no longer hold. If established settlements were being forced to abandon their traditional locations, new alliances might be possible with displaced groups seeking protection and stability. The keeper of the granaries reminded the council that the city's food stores, while substantial, were not unlimited. Any major construction project would require feeding additional workers while potentially disrupting the agricultural activities that sustained the current population. The delicate balance between consumption and production that allowed such a large settlement to exist in one location could be easily upset by overambitious planning. But it was the voice of the eldest among the tradition keepers that finally cut through the tactical discussions to address the heart of the matter. Rising slowly from her place at the back of the gathering, she reminded the council that their ancestors had chosen this location not merely for its practical advantages, but because the confluence of waters had been marked by the spirits as a place of power and permanence. To abandon such a site in favor of some temporary advantage would be to sever connections that had sustained the people through countless previous challenges. Yet, even as she spoke of permanence and spiritual obligation, the old woman acknowledged that adaptation had always been the key to survival, in a world where rivers rose and fell, where trading partners might become enemies and strangers might become allies, where the forces that shaped the earth operated on scales beyond human influence or control. The question facing the council was not whether to change, but how to change in ways that preserved what was most essential, while discarding what had become burden rather than blessing. The chief, who had remained silent through hours of discussion, finally spoke as the shadows began to lengthen toward evening. His words were measured, careful, chosen with the awareness that they would be repeated and analyzed for years to come. He spoke of the city's responsibility not just to its current inhabitants, but to the generations who would come after, who deserved to inherit not just wealth and security, but the wisdom to adapt as their predecessors had adapted. As darkness settled over the city and torches were lit throughout the central plaza, The council moved from discussion to decision with the gravity that such moments demanded. The formal protocols that governed the reaching of consensus were ancient and complex, requiring not just majority support but the kind of broad agreement that could withstand the challenges that any significant decision would inevitably face. By the torchlit council, they chose labor over legend. To cut seasonal diversion ditches, raise low earthen levees, sink weirs where the current split, move 2 docks to deeper backwaters, and set a temporary camp upstream for the runners who kept the roots breathing. It would take hands, not miracles, and it would buy the city time to listen to the river again. The massive earthwork projects that had been discussed as emergency responses to the northern crisis would be undertaken, but not merely to redirect water flows. Instead, they would create a series of artificial channels and reservoirs that would make the city largely independent of the river's natural moods, capable of supporting its population and maintaining its ceremonial obligations, even if the Great Water completely changed its course. Such independence would require resources beyond anything previously attempted, but would also create capabilities that no competing settlement could match. More significantly, the city would begin actively recruiting skilled craftsmen, traders, and leaders from settlements throughout the region, offering them opportunities and security that they could find nowhere else. Rather than competing for control of traditional trade routes, the city would become the center of an entirely new kind of network, one based not on geographic advantage alone, but on the concentrated talents and resources that such recruitment would make possible. The decision represented a fundamental transformation in the city's identity and purpose, a shift from being the largest among many similar settlements to becoming something qualitatively different from anything that had existed before in the region. It was a gamble on a scale that would determine not just the city's fate, but the entire future pattern of settlement and development across the river valleys and trade networks that connected the heart of the continent to its distant edges. As the formal agreements were sealed with the ancient words and gestures that bound the council's decision to the spiritual forces that governed the people's relationship with the land and waters, the participants understood that they had committed themselves to an undertaking that would challenge every assumption about what was possible in their world. The work would take years, perhaps decades, to complete, and would require sacrifices from every family, every craft guild, every residential district within the city's boundaries. When the council finally dispersed near midnight, the torches that had illuminated their deliberations continued to burn in the plaza, tended by the traditional keepers whose responsibility it was to ensure that the sacred fire never died completely. The light they cast seemed to push back the darkness with special intensity, as if responding to the magnitude of what had been decided within the great lodge on the tallest mound. The city slept uneasily that night, though most of its inhabitants would not learn the details of the council's decision until the following day's public announcement. Dreams were troubled by visions of earth and water in constant motion, of massive constructions rising from the floodplain like mountain ranges built by human will, of canoes arriving from distances previously unimaginable, carrying people and goods from territories not yet explored. But there were also dreams of abundance, of craft workshops whose products would be sought after from the cold northern forests to the warm southern seas, of ceremonial gatherings that would draw participants from every corner of the known world, of a permanence and prosperity that could weather any storm or disruption that the future might bring. The runner, who had played such a crucial role in precipitating the night's decisions, prepared for the return journey that would carry news of the council's response back to the northern settlements that had sent her south with their warnings. She understood better than most how completely the city's transformation would reshape the patterns of trade and diplomacy that had defined the region for generations, and she anticipated the mixture of excitement and apprehension that her report would generate among the leaders who awaited her return. As dawn approached and the eastern sky began to show the first hints of light, the city stirred with the restless energy of a place on the verge of fundamental change. The normal rhythms of daily life would continue, but underlying them now was the awareness that everything familiar was about to be challenged and potentially transformed by the massive undertaking to which the council had committed the people's future. The chief, who had slept little after the night's deliberations, stood on the platform that extended from his lodge toward the river, watching the water flow past in the growing light. The river continued its ancient course as it had for countless generations before the city existed, and would continue long after any human settlement had returned to Earth, but now it would flow past something unprecedented in its long history. "We sleep once more," he whispered to the moving water, echoing the ritual words that closed each night's activities. "At first light, we decide with the river.